What is the socio-cultural and historical background of sexual assault among Indigenous peoples in Canada, and why is it important? How can we equip individuals to speak up and stand up against the sexual assault crisis among Indigenous peoples? How can we inspire discussions and solutions that are reflective of Indigenous culture, values, and practices? No matter your identity and background, everybody can play a positive role in ending this horrible reality that too many Indigenous men, women, and children endure. Statistics show that the rate of sexual assault among Indigenous people, 58 out of 1,000, is almost 3 times that of non-Indigenous. Since sexual assault is one of the most underreported statistics, we can assume that the actual number is even higher than that. This means that if you are born Indigenous in Canada, you are at least 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault in your lifetime. This is an alarming statistic. Let us explore how today's alarming rate of sexual assault among Indigenous people came to be. What led these people to end up in such a heartbreaking reality? Let's look at 4 key historical time periods to explain. For centuries, Indigenous peoples in North America lived in balance with each other, animals, and the earth. We viewed all people and living things as equals, and our worldview expressed a concern for the common good. While our societies were not immune to challenges and conflicts, our systems of governance, processes of conflict resolution, and moral codes kept our communities and nations healthy and in balance. Regarding physicality, sexuality, and relationships, all people were equal in dignity. Sex and sexuality were not perverse. Various physical boundaries were respected. Women were true equals, and two-spirited individuals were often revered. Upon arrival of the first European settlers, the relationship with the Indigenous peoples already occupying the land was fluid. While conflicts arose, settlers relied on Indigenous peoples to learn about the land and its resources, to trade, and above all, to learn how to survive in a foreign land. An example of this initial relationship is the Guswanta, otherwise known as the Two-Row Wampum Treaty between the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, and the Dutch. The agreement says that the 2 rows, symbolizing their culture, laws, traditions, and way of life, represent 2 separate vessels traveling parallel to each other down the river of life. They agreed that each should stay in their own vessels, without interfering or impeding the other. The Guswanta symbolizes a healthy and respectful relationship between European settlers and the Indigenous people of North America. As more time passed, the relationship between European settlers and Indigenous nations quickly deteriorated. European empires sought to conquer North America, occupying the land, expanding their populations, and imposing their beliefs and values. For hundreds of years, the exploitation of Indigenous lands and peoples ensued. There were attacks on all fronts, but certain components had a particularly negative effect on Indigenous physicality, sexuality, and relationships. Deeming Indigenous bodies as impure, pagan, or dirty provided a rationalization for the mass genocide of Indigenous peoples. Patriarchal ideology left European women disadvantaged, let alone Indigenous women, who were systematically mistreated without justice. The imposition of mind changers, alcohol, and drugs began widespread substance abuse. The most destructive was the brutal assimilation that stripped Indigenous peoples of their culture and values. Traditional languages and practices were outlawed, and generations of children were forced into residential schools, where they were taken from their families, punished for being Indigenous, and where 1 in 5 of them were sexually abused. This was the beginning of a cultural deterioration and cycle of intergenerational trauma that still exists. Today, Indigenous physicality, sexuality, and relationships are plagued by continued colonialism, racism, sexism, as well as other intergenerational traumas. Violence, mental health disorders, and trafficking exist at alarming rates. While a variety of conditions exist across nations, statistics show that in Canada, 4% of the total population are Indigenous, yet they represent 48% of children in protective care and half of all victims of human trafficking. 8 out of 10 Indigenous women reported being a victim of physical, sexual, psychological abuse. 1 out of 3 of the women who are incarcerated are Indigenous. Suicide rates among First Nations are 5 times higher for men and 7 times higher for women compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts. And alcoholism and substance abuse problems begin before the age of 12 years old. What is our strategy for realigning our societies with our traditional values? How do we utilize modern and traditional treatment methods for victims and aggressors? How do we heal our families, communities, and nations? How are you speaking out and standing up against sexual assault? No matter your identity and background, everybody can play a positive role in ending this horrible reality that too many Indigenous men, women, and children endure. Join the movement by using the Doing My Part and We Heal Together hashtags. For more information, visit Quebec Native Women's webpage.